we are discussing today a very hot topic, which I know has already been discussed on the opening plenary, even of the WTO, this issue of TRIPS, the role of TRIPS waivers potentially in extending access to vaccines and COVID commodities, in fact, which we know is really quite a contentious issue that's really exercising many governments' minds at the moment. So just to encourage our growing audience, I'm delighted to see so many of you joining the session, that we're very keen to get your questions, that, you know, this isn't just going to be a chat amongst the five of us, that we're very keen on citizen participation. We were just talking to Dr. Mazumdar Shaw about this, that we're very keen to hear your views about this very, very important issue. The way that we're going to organize this session is that I'm going to ask our participants to speak for about 5 minutes to give their views on the topic, and then I'll perhaps pose 1 or 2 questions myself. But please, audience members, if you can post your questions, I know you're not going to be doing that through the Zoom function that we're using, but through the WTO registration system that you've joined. And with any luck, questions will appear on the laptop to my right, and I'll be able to read them out to the audience. I must say, none have come up yet, so I hope I am logged into the right page. Otherwise, we could be in a bit of trouble here. But anyway, we'll do our best to field your questions and put them to the audience. So my name, incidentally, I should say, is Robert Yates. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Universal Health at Chatham House in London. And we specialise in the politics of health and health reforms, particularly looking at this important topic of universal health coverage, that everyone gets the health services they need without suffering financial hardship. And you'll be aware that just before the pandemic, every country in the world signed up to this great goal yet again at the United Nations in September 2019. And but little did we know that so quickly the world was going to be put to the test, as, you know, sort of how effectively we were going to ensure that everyone got the health services they need in the midst of a global pandemic. And of course, what we're finding as countries are tackling the pandemic, that is the importance of everybody, literally everyone on the planet, getting access to the public health measures that are needed, but also increasingly to the vaccines that are being produced. And what we've seen, particularly in 2021, is that at the beginning of the year, many vaccines came online. I think we were all delighted how successful scientific collaboration had resulted in so many vaccines becoming available. But then this year has not been a particularly pretty picture in terms of the distribution of those vaccines. We've got gross inequalities across the world, you know, to the extent that countries like the UK, where I'm speaking from, have sort of reached 80–90% coverage rates, and many low-income countries are still in single figures. In fact, you know, sort of barely above 1 or 2% in many cases. And clearly, if we're going to hold to the ideals of universal health coverage, this has to be registered as a failure. So people are really sort of talking about drastic measures to overcome this, and you know, what will be needed. And in the run-up to a number of events this year, you've seen quite a sort of unanimous view about the importance of scaling up vaccine coverage and sharing vaccines, funding the likes of the ACT Accelerator properly. But the very important topic as well of technology transfers. How do we ensure that the supply of vaccines increases rapidly, but perhaps as importantly, that they are available equitably across the world, which they're patently not, patently not at the moment. So our panel will be discussing this very important topic, and I would like to start our discussions, please. I'll introduce the panel first. That we're delighted to have with us and speaking in this order, Dr. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, who is the Executive Chairperson of Biocon and Biocon Biologics. We have the Right Honourable Sir Robin Jacob, who is the Hugh Laddie Professor of Intellectual Property Law and Director of the Institute of Brand and Innovation Law at University College London. We have Tahir Amin, who is co-founder and co-executive director of IMAC, which is an NGO specializing in patent law reforms. And in a change to the previous speaker, we're delighted to have Lina Mengani join us, who is the Global IP Advisor for the MSF Access Campaign. Unfortunately, Winnie Binyamima couldn't join us, but we're delighted that Lina could replace her at the last moment. Now, Kieran, I'd like to start with you, please. And I'm conscious that you have to call off at the bottom of the hour, and because you have a sort of a prior engagement. So if you could address this topic first for us, please, and I might just pose one or two questions to you first, because you might not be able to take the questions as the audience members call in. So yes, as a manufacturer, someone involved in this topic in India, how do you think potentially TRIPS waivers could help, or might they not?
So, Robin, thanks for having me on this panel. And I think it's a very, very important subject, because I think health equity is so important for the world, and especially during the pandemic, vaccine equity is something we're all very concerned about. And I do believe that, if you look at the way we have gone about developing vaccines at such, warp speed, so to speak, I think is commendable in the sense that regulatory agencies have basically enabled this very, very proactively and pragmatically. But I also want to say that most companies who basically develop patented drugs have to make huge investments to develop such drugs, right? And therefore, the patent protection is given for them to earn back their investments. I mean, that's the way I look at patents in certain ways. In this case, I think many companies have benefited from huge endowments or funding support from agencies like BARDA and other kind of funding, like EU and other kinds of funding. And they've also benefited from very, very abbreviated and accelerated clinical development, largely funded by these kind of agencies. So if you think about it, whilst I completely, understand the companies, need to have patent protection for their products, in this particular case, I think they've had a huge handout from various governments and agencies, and they've had a huge benefit of very, very short regulatory approval timelines, and they've been able to commercialize these vaccines both at speed and scale in that sense. So the question I ask is, isn't this a time to, it's not about waiving the intellectual property, but it's really about making sure that we should have actually negotiated right up front for the kind of investments and financial support that we're giving these companies, some kind of commitment from these companies to, to provide their vaccines to COVAX and Gavi. I think we missed that opportunity because it was all about just getting a vaccine out in time. Now I believe that there is a huge inequity, and like you just said, whilst most parts of the advanced world have got 80 to 90% of their eligible populations vaccinated with both vaccines, and they're now talking about a booster shot, many parts of the world haven't even got one shot. And you said that many parts of the developing and LMIC countries are at single-digit vaccination, which I think is absolutely unacceptable. The kind of things we need to talk about is, how do we make sure that we create the scale to make sure that there is vaccine equity? Because I know that in India, for example, we have the scale that and as the largest vaccine producing nation in the world, I know we have scale, but the scale is just not enough for a pandemic, right? And I think that's where the real problem is. How do we basically make sure that we get the scale in a very expeditious manner to be able to serve the whole world. I don't think it's just about tech transfer, because I think people underestimate the complexity and the real scientific challenge of just transferring technology. It's not that simple. So I just think that we need to look at developing these vaccine producing centers in many, many parts of the world, where you can actually create the scale and the supply chain that you need. I mean, right now, it's not just about transferring technology, but it's also about the supply chain disruption in terms of the components for the vaccines, the adjuvants, the various requirements of resin and what have you for vaccine production that is in short supply. So it's not just about the vaccine, it's about the entire supply chain. How do you now go back and make sure that you have a complete supply chain that can actually cater to such a surge demand at a time of a pandemic? I think that's what we really need to focus on. And in that, obviously, you're not going to focus on patents, but you're going to basically tell these companies that they've got to basically make sure that they have enough partners around the world who can make their vaccines, either the bulk vaccine or the fill and finish. I think we need to work out that kind of a strategy where actually patents don't come in the way. I mean, let me be very honest. Many of the vaccine companies have suspended their patents, saying, okay, guys, we are not going to enforce these patents. Go ahead and make them if you can. But it's easier said than done, right? So I just think that we need to look at it in a more practical, sensible way, rather than getting very emotional about just the tech transfer and patents. It's really a much bigger challenge that we have, which is about the supply chain, the capacity, which are so short right now. And I think we need to plan and focus strategically on building that ecosystem, which can quickly, cater to a surge demand during a pandemic. That's the way I look at it. So it's not just about patents.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That's an ideal start to the discussions. And if I could just pose a sort of question to you immediately, because I'm conscious that you have to leave early. But that's India, of course. Indian generic manufacturers were very instrumental in sort of breaking the sort of the patent situation about sort of getting HIV medicines into Africa. We're very sort of conscious of the work that Cipla Pharmaceuticals did in those issues. How active do you think sort of the big Indian generic manufacturers will be? Were there to be a sort of a change in sort of patent laws, and were things to get freed up? How quickly do you think that Indian manufacturers would be able to sort of step up and reach some of this scale that's required? Because what you seem to be saying is that in a pandemic, when literally the entire planet needs vaccines, new rules should apply. And I'm just wondering, sort of how much do you think that Indian manufacturers will be able to step up?
I think Indian manufacturers have stepped up. I know that, Serum Institute, for instance, has just rolled out 1 billion doses of vaccines of the Covishield or AstraZeneca vaccine. And I know that, the other companies, Bharat Biotech is also ramping up its own capacity. The Biological E is also trying to ramp up its capacity. But I think what we need to really look at is what are the vaccines we really need to basically make sure that we vaccinate. Right now, Biological E is basically still developing vaccines. But why couldn't we use that capacity for, say, other vaccines which are approved, and get them to at least supply that? We are not using a lot of the capacity that is available to us. So that's what I mean by saying better planning of capacity utilization, and better planning in terms of how do you transfer technologies to companies who know what it's like to make vaccines. Exactly. Today, the Indian pharma company, the generic company, were very, very instrumental in basically catering to the generic drug needs of the pandemic. So, for instance, I know that Remdesivir, for instance, which was, where Gilead actually allowed many parts of the developing world to produce remdesivir, where they gave the technology and said, okay, just make the product and sell it to 120 countries in the world, LMIC countries. I think Indian companies did a great job there because they quickly developed the drug, and it was approved. And, I think they catered to a lot of that need. Similarly, of course, there were lots of requirements of steroids and, antibiotics and what have you. And I think many, many Indian companies have been able to scale up at a moment's notice. So I think the same thing happens for vaccines. I just find that many vaccine capacities are getting utilized today for developing new vaccines. And I think you're losing out on capacity utilization. So I'm just giving that as an example, saying if you had biological E, which has a large capacity, and if you could actually if you could produce either the Covaxin or Covishield that is made in India, you would have actually expanded that capacity. But you didn't. You kept reserving that capacity for other vaccines which are yet not approved. I'm sure this is the same case in the case of Korean companies that are developing vaccines. Many of the Korean companies have huge capacity, but they're developing new vaccines, so their capacity is basically waiting for those vaccines to be approved, rather than using something that is already approved and using those facilities for ramping up capacity. That's what I meant.
Interesting. Yeah. So that really smacks of major market failures that you've got under the utilized capacity. In this situation at the moment. Thank you so much indeed for your contributions, Dr. Shaw. And obviously, if you can stay on that, that's wonderful. But we do understand that.
Yeah, I can stay for another 15 minutes, but I'll have to go after that.
Fantastic. Okay. And so, as Robin, if I can turn to you now, that you have been very active in this field for a number of years, and you were just explaining before that you've, as a judge, had to sort of decide on a number of these issues in the past. So, looking specifically at the pandemic, how important do you think patent waivers could be in this process, or perhaps do you think this is a potentially a distraction?
It's a complete distraction. The problem that nobody's using patents to stop anybody doing anything. The big problem is ramping up production.
Yes.
These vaccines are immensely complicated things to make. They're not like small molecules. Quite a lot of, we've got a number of instances of different manufacturers, their things have gone wrong in the place with all the top people they've got who make it. And what we want is more capacity. Fortunately, they're building their capacity. So the number of vaccines by the end of next year will be enough for the world and more. But this is not a patent problem of any kind whatever. What I want to talk about really is the future. I'm going to say something which is slightly shocking, but actually dead true if you think about it. As pandemics go, this is a pretty soft one. It's not in the same class as the flu, which killed my grandfather in 1919. It's not in the same class as the Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population. This doesn't take children. The next one might. So what do we want? What we want to do is to learn from this one. Patent waiver's got nothing to do with this one. And what we've got to learn is this, that we need more vaccine research. And that research has got to take not just about the vaccines themselves and how quickly we can adapt a vaccine to a new virus, create a vaccine. We need possibly research into more methods of making the mRNA vaccines were a new kind of vaccine. They wouldn't exist but for the patent system incentive which produced them. In the early part of about 5-10 years ago, the ideas came up. The AstraZeneca type vaccine is a classical type of vaccine. I'm not sure there are any patents on it at all. It's just a question of developing it and getting it approved. using fragments of the virus. But the future, the next pandemic and the pandemic after, the scientists are telling it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
They've been saying it's going to happen, and it has happened. They thought SARS, which was a much nastier disease than this one, killed many more people relatively to who got it. And there will be another. So the question we should be facing is put this distraction about patent waiver on one side, say, how do we get the world ready for the next one? And that includes people who know how to make vaccines, regulators ready to regulate, because the regulation of vaccines is pretty important. If you're going to stick stuff in people, you've got to get it right. And this one has got nasty side effects in a few. Maybe we'll never produce a vaccine which doesn't have some side effects in some. But the scale of production is important. At the moment, the other big subject is distribution. I mean, some vaccines are going to rot. These don't last forever. They've got a time limit. And some of them had to be thrown away. That's what we've got to be looking at. How are you going to distribute this? I mean, you can think of parts of the world where it's going to be impossible. How could you do it in Yemen, which is in civil war? So we've got a problem. We have to vaccinate the world, and we will have to revaccinate the world against something else, probably within the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, possibly. And we've got to get ready for that. And that's what who should be looking at. Forget all about patent waivers. It's got nothing whatever to do with this problem at all.
Thank you very much indeed to Robin. And maybe if I can turn it over to Tahir now, who I'm taking a punt here, might have a slightly different perspective on that. So Tahir, what do you think about the role of sort of patents, particularly in this pandemic and potentially future ones?
So before I go, can I just say that I completely agree that we are, basically, it's a red herring to keep focusing on patent waivers. I think we need to do much more than that. And I agree with Sir Robin.
Thanks for that, Kieran. So we wanted to get a well-balanced panel. So I'm suspecting that our next two speakers might have differing views on that, and we can then open it up to Q&A. So Tahir, over to you. What do you think about the role of sort of patents? Not only just for vaccines, of course. We are looking at all commodities, be they diagnostics and therapeutics as well.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. I think that's the important starting point. A lot of the conversation happens and focuses on vaccines, but the proposed waiver is about all medical technologies that can be used for COVID. And just when we got emergency use authorization for monoclonal antibodies, you've got new potential antiviral oral pills that are coming down the pipeline. Those are also things that we need to be able to supply on a larger scale. So whilst there is a lot of attention on vaccines, naturally, I think one has to remember that this proposal is broader than that. But I like to have these conversations in context. I think there's a lot of focus on distractions. People want to distract people away from patents. But I'd like to give some historical context for why we're actually here. Last week was the UN General Assembly, and a lot of the discussion was about vaccine equity. And it took me back to an event that happened nearly 50 years ago at the UN General Assembly, when many new nation states were emerging from disintegrating European empires. And the UN General Assembly resolved to declare a new international economic order in which wealthy countries would help formerly colonized ones become more self-reliant and transfer technology. And proponents of the scheme imagine such transfers as a form of reparation for the decades of imperial plunder. But instead, we got the opposite. At the behest of the then CEO of Pfizer, which is a big player in this pandemic, Edmund Pratt, fearing that manufacturers in developing countries would compete with companies like his for these markets, they actually started the process of what we now have, the TRIPS agreement. And so here we are. The TRIPS agreement emerged in 1995. And when we talk about technology transfer and we talk about why our systems are failing, I think we have to look at the World Trade Organization and the way the patent systems and the IP systems were imposed on a number of these countries that now are fighting for vaccines. So I just like to lay that context, because often we talk about these things in the current, but history tells us so much more. And so there's a few points I want to make about the arguments that keep getting put forward about, the one is it's not about IP, it's about lack of technical capacity, the ability to manufacture, supply chains and all that stuff, which Kiran has pointed out in her conversation. I think this argument rehearses a tired trope. In fact, I know Robin said it's a distraction. We need to, the whole patent conversation is distraction. Well, the other side is playing a game of distraction too. And that number one argument that, companies can't make these vaccines and so on and so forth is a distraction in itself. I mean, Kiran even just said herself, the capacity is there, we're just not using it. And so, and she's right, yes, maybe government should have actually written into these contracts that you're going to supply. But that was a failure because the system of IP is a failure because the companies don't operate like that. The financialization of intellectual property today causes companies to actually not give up those kinds of markets because they've got their quarterly reports to turn on. I mean, Pfizer, for example, is making more money on its vaccine than the best-selling drugs in the world. And these are for chronic diseases that we take on a daily basis. So this is what this is about. Well, it's about power too. And that's why I go back to the historical context. So, this idea that the IP system as an idea, it's a great idea, but in practice, human beings just don't behave in a civilized way when you give that much power away. So the idea of that these companies can't make these manufacturers is a tired trope. I mean, the classic one is the Hepatitis B vaccine in the 1980s, when Shanta Biotech they went to Western companies for transfer. It's a great story. And they were told, well, even if you could buy this technology, you wouldn't know how to use it. And yet they went on to make their own vaccine. And it cost them $1 a day as opposed to the $23 that the Mercks and the GSK were selling it for. And as a result, UN agencies were able to inoculate many more people. And this has been happening in the HIV pandemic. I know antiviral drugs are very different to vaccines, the complexities. Having studied vaccines for Gavi, I've spoken to a number of manufacturers around the world, in China, in Brazil, in India, to understand how intellectual property hampers them. And it does. It hampers them from getting licenses from other technology providers to these big branded companies, because everyone's trying to get a hold of the various components. So the idea that there aren't people out there ready to build this capacity is a myth. There's Inceptor, which has gone to Moderna and said, give us a tech transfer. Moderna just won't do it. You've got Indian companies that are making the Sputnik vaccine that have said we can actually transfer our technology to make the J&J. It's not happening. You've even got Suhaib Siddiqui from Moderna, who used to be the director of chemistry there, who said that companies, given the blueprint, could actually turn this around in 3 to 4 months, not 3 to 4 years, 3 to 4 months. So, this, and then the other argument is, oh, well, if we do this TRIPS waiver, it's going to, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Well, I think Kiran's already pointed out the amount of money that has gone into this from public funding. And sure, the private pharmaceutical companies have put in their investments too. But at the same time, we can't put all this down at the feet of the intellectual property system. And I think, one of the classic things, we talk about future pandemics and what have you. Yes. Well, I think, first of all, there's nearly 5 million people that have passed away. And by the economist standards, it actually might be more than that. I think there's a projected figure of 15 million because of the difficulty in compiling these numbers. And the worst thing is that back in the Spanish flu, we never had these tools. We have these tools today and we're still failing. And I think that is a true indictment of the lack of our ability in terms of our evolution as human beings, that when we have all this technology, we still can't actually make it available. And I would just like to say, in future pandemic preparedness, in 2018, global funding for basic research and product development for infected diseases, which I also include pandemic preparedness in that, was about $4 billion. Of this funding, 64% came from public tax dollars. 19% came from philanthropic organizations. Only 17, that's $650 million, came from pharmaceutical sector, the private pharmaceutical sector, which is a drop in the ocean when you consider the revenue of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies was more than 661 billion in 2019. It's not even 1%. They don't care about these things unless they are given the incentive, they're given, reams of cash to actually bring it to market. This would not have happened had it not been for the public funding. So let's be clear, this is not a distraction, that intellectual property is not the winner in all this. The winner was that there was actually so many other pieces that went into this. And I think the failure is that now we're not sharing that technology, making it available for everyone. And I think that's why it's important that we have some form of moratorium or just hold on intellectual property until we get out of this crisis. And then we need to look at our institutions. We need to relook at the WTO completely. How can it be that a handful of countries can actually hold everyone else sort of hostage and say, actually, you can't do this? And the West goes around teaching good governance. And yet, when it comes to democracy and institution like the World Trade Organization, which was never a democratic institution, we need to change that kind of power dynamic. So I'll just leave it there because I think some of the distractions from distractions are just really making this a sort of an argument which is actually not really telling us the full story. Okay,
thanks very much indeed to hear. And if I can maybe as well now turn to Lena, who I know that MSF have been extremely involved in these issues for a number of years, the access campaign run by MSF. What's your perception specifically on this pandemic, Lena? And the importance. Are patents a distraction, or do you think it's part of the problem?
Well, patents are one of the key issues that relate to power and control over what is produced and where it's produced. So we can't discount that aspect. And I'm going to highlight it in two different ways. One as a feminist lawyer and one as having worked for Doctors Without Borders. And I'm going to talk about issues that we've learned from the past epidemics. If you look at 2005, when India was changing its patent law, Tahir was in India. And one of the first things I noticed when I joined MSF was that barely 40 people were getting tenofovir. Now, tenofovir is an incredibly powerful antiretroviral drug that suppresses viral load. Something like that for COVID would be hugely useful. And barely 40 of MSF's patients, after years of negotiation, had access to the drug. And what we did was find the patent claims, and it took us 10 years to systematically challenge each and every patent application in India, but also in Brazil, China, Ukraine, and a number of other countries. So what we learned from the past epidemic is that generic manufacturing capacity is there, and we are treatment providers, so I'm going to talk about therapeutics essentially. You have capacity in Bangladesh, India, Egypt, and I could go on in Latin America as well. We all know that scaling up generic capacity for antivirals and antiretrovirals led to saving lives of millions of people. But those lives were saved because lawyers like Tahir and IMAC went out to give legal aid to organizations like MSF to challenge these patents. Now, we can spend a decade doing that with COVID, but I don't think we have essentially a decade to fight this pandemic. So why can't we fast forward? And we already know that patent claims have been filed or will be filed on newer antivirals that the US government is funding right now, right under our noses. Why should we have to wait for the patents to be granted and then try to find a solution country by country? So that's one. A number of speakers have mentioned voluntary licenses, and it always comes up. Well, we can leave it to industry to decide where generics should be available and where not. And our experience really shows that, the World Trade Organization has divided countries into high income, middle income, low income. But poor people and government budgets are constrained everywhere. So the licenses is essentially that have been negotiated through the medicines patent pool, for example, have left out upper middle income countries. For example, China is a classic example. Sofosbuvir, the backbone of hepatitis C treatment. Right now, Gilead is trying to block Chinese pharmaceutical companies from making the generic and making it available to Chinese patients and Chinese government. So our experience of antivirals and antiretrovirals clearly highlights that if you leave it to pharmaceutical corporations to patent, and not just once, several times the same drug, we are not going to be able to treat everyone who needs to be treated, and we are in 60 countries. So as MSF, we stand behind the waiver. So that's one aspect of what I wanted to say. The second aspect I wanted to say is, what is intellectual property? People talk about patents and intellectual property together. Now, I'm not going to be a lawyer, but I can tell you this. A lot of very interesting information lies in regulatory dossiers, and regulatory dossiers are protected. There's data protection, and I'm for data protection in certain contexts, but data protection against public interest. So that's also comes under the realm of intellectual property. We can talk about trade secrets as well. Pharmaceutical corporations have been choosing to enforce the intellectual property in different ways. Kiran may be on this call or not, and she may have left, but when she tried to launch trastuzumab, this is the monoclonal antibody for breast cancer, I was a feminist lawyer, and her company faced an onslaught from Roche in the Delhi High Court. And it was not just restricted to just patents, it was restricted to data exclusivity, to copyright violation over the package insert. And it was the work that we did as feminist lawyers, as civil society, to highlight that to the Indian government that they should actually protect biosimilar versions of trastuzumab so they could be available in India. But it was a big legal IP enforcement battle. And that's what exactly Roche would like to do with monoclonal antibodies. And I can just simply say that if we leave the rules to pharmaceutical corporations, right now we want 6,000 vials from Roche of tocilizumab. We have not been able to negotiate that for months. For a couple of months, we've been asking just for 6,000 vials. And I would like to know how much they supply to the US government of tocilizumab. They are refusing to give us 6,000 vials. Roche is essentially refusing to share the master cell lines, is refusing to share the regulatory dossiers. And simply by waiving a few patents in LMICs, it still holds on to a lot of intellectual property control over the drug. I would essentially end by saying that if we are to look at intellectual property very narrowly as just patents, if we are to look at the waiver very narrowly in the context of just tying it up with the technology transfer discussions, I think we are doing ourselves a disfavor. The TRIPS waiver is a wedge issue. It is allowing us to put all of these issues on the table and discuss them openly, honestly. And as MSF, we would like technology to be shared not just by US corporations, but also by Indian companies with the hub that's been set up in South Africa. However, we are not tying that discussion on technology transfer to the intellectual property issue. We want both. And that's where MSF is. And I'm going to stop there. I think our first-hand experience of working in developing countries is far more richer than an ideological battle over intellectual property between pharmaceutical corporations and a few rich governments. And I would say, people who say intellectual property does not matter are precisely in a number of high-income countries. And you've come to developing countries, and you are in these courts where IP is being enforced against you. It instantly becomes an issue. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much indeed, Lena. So some contrasting views there, but I think some degree of consensus, certainly about the need to scale up manufacturing. I think we all agreed that we need to sort of scale up manufacturing fast, and that particularly with potentially even worse pandemics around the corner. This may have been the wake-up call, and we need to really speed up the production right across the world. Differences, though, as to whether sort of patents are sort of a main obstacle to that or not. One view that it's sort of trivial and not important, another that it's absolutely integral to the misallocation of resources at the moment. I'd like to start to bring in questions from the audience, please. I'm delighted to see that the system is working very well. So I'm seeing questions coming up on my other screen here, which I'll refer to. One from Jessica Hamer, who is asking about this issue of technology transfers. And I think it's sort of fair to say that it has been rather pedestrian so far. That whereas great claims have been made about sort of rapid tech transfers, this hasn't been happening at the scale we would have hoped. And there have been these attempts to create these mRNA hubs in South Africa. I know that Senegal, Rwanda, and Indonesia are interested in doing this, but it would appear that there hasn't been a big uptake from the companies who have the technology at the moment. So Jessica's asking, what needs to happen to get originator companies to engage more in technology transfers, and what incentives need to be brought to these discussions? So what can happen to really improve these tech transfers? I don't know who would like to sort of take that first. Tahir, you got your hand up first, so first come, first serve, and then Sir Robin, you might have a view on this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think when we look at what Kieran said about BARDA putting in so much money, I mean, the Moderna vaccine, for example, is pretty much funded by government dollars. Even some of the underlying patents are government patents. And just to that whole statement that companies have waived patents, actually Moderna came out with a bit of a sort of red herring statement saying they're waiving the patents, but actually didn't say they were going to give any tech transfer. And so it really, and later Bansal said actually you can't actually make the vaccines from what's written in the patents, which then got me to the whole disclosure requirements of patents, but that's a different story. So basically, I think the US government needs to lean on Moderna, and they need to actually say, you guys have got to get into bed with a number of manufacturers and actually to transfer that technology. The US government has that ability. It hasn't enacted it yet. And I think that's what needs to happen. And similarly, the German government could do that to BioNTech. It funded BioNTech to the tune of nearly 500 million euros. So there's a lot that the governments could be doing here. And I think they're part of the problem too. They're not actually mandating these private actors to really do something for the better of humanity.
Mm-hmm. You say lean on, and it's interesting. Is this leaning? Is this carrots or sticks? Would you say is it incentives, or do you think we're sort of looking at?
Oh, I think they've been given enough. I think they've had enough incentives. I mean, the fact, like I said, with the profits that they're generating, I think the problem is they're seeing their market, and analysts have actually said by 2024, the requirements for vaccines will probably drop off. And so, profits which are now in the high 20 billions might drop to 2 billion. They're milking this out. This is a pandemic cash cow for them. So I think the governments need to step in and just say, right, you guys, you've got your return, right? We're stepping in, and we need to get there faster than the end of 2022.
Mm-hmm. So Robin, what do you feel about that? I mean, do you think the tech transfers have been done at sufficient rate, or do you think a bit more sort of carrot and stick might be needed to speed things up? You might just want to unmute there, I think, Sir Robin. Oh, can we unmute Sir Robin? There you go. Yeah.
So I think this is probably another red herring. First of all, I'm just going to stand back. I'm going to make this observation. No new medicine reached the market other than through pharma companies since the war. And if we want a succession of new medicines, and I'm not talking now about vaccines, we would look at the system which did that. And there are defects in the system. Curiously enough, the system is not good at producing medicines which cure. Imagine a pill which you took one pill and it cured you of some dreadful disease. What would you charge for it? And the answer is you can't charge what it might really be worth, which is thousands. And I think we have a big problem there. And that's why there's an antibiotics. And Timon talked about antibiotics, and the figures he gave may well be sort of right. The government's doing the funding and the pharma companies not. Many pharma companies have given up because there's no money in it. And that's where we've got to be looking at, where the patent system doesn't work, where the patent system doesn't reach. Now, as regards tech transfer, that's a very difficult subject. I don't know enough about it, but I hear that actually this business of, it's not just a recipe, like a recipe in a book which goes to a good chef. It's the good chefs you need. And manufacturing these vaccines is very tricky. And that's why we've had things go wrong in a number of different companies. The whole batches have had to be thrown away. And the idea that we should divert the effort from these companies who are making the stuff as fast as they can and trying to build up production and are building up production to go and teach people who are starting at a much lower base seems to be a complete waste of space. What matters is not where the vaccines are made, but who gets them. These are not difficult to transport around the world. An aeroplane can carry a hell of a lot of vaccine. So don't think.
So why isn't that happening at the moment, Sir Robin? You know, we've obviously got this, phenomenal misallocation.
I will tell you why it's happening. Vaccine production is going up in the places where they can make it as fast as it can go. And I'm afraid it's human nature. People have said we're keeping it at home. India did it too. But we're moving to the point now where there's enough for the world coming on stream. And I suppose if you look back on it, that's what you would have expected. And it wouldn't have made any difference if you'd had less vaccine in some of the Western countries and more vaccines in some other countries. It looked as though some of the Western countries were the biggest victims of this early on in this disease. If you looked at Africa, fortunately, in the early part, Africa was relatively untouched, except for South Africa. So I don't believe the idea that you can tell companies to go off and teach other companies how to do use their trade secrets is a practical runner at all. Mm-hmm. This is not just a question of a license. This is a question of saying you've got to go and take resources and use it for some other people. I just don't think it'll work.
Thank you. Alina, what's your thoughts?
My thoughts are, we are arguing for an intellectual property system and a system that, of course, favors multinational corporations at the cost of lives. And basically what you're essentially saying, you're arguing that we should keep the intellectual property system unreformed as it is right now. So we just leave it without reform, despite the millions of people who lose their lives, not just in the pandemic, but otherwise. No, can I just finish? We don't reform it. We've not been allowed to reform it. Political pressure is put when we want to reform it. So that rich people and high income countries can get their medicines, while people of color and poor and marginalized people have to give up their lives to keep this intellectual property and the profits of pharma going. So that's essentially what we are arguing. Essentially, we are arguing that the system favors certain people and we keep the system going, and poor and marginalized people and people of color should lose their lives to keep the system essentially going on. And I'm a first-hand witness to it in my own country. Number two is this: when we talk about capacities in developing countries, we speak about it in a sweeping fashion. And we have to recognize that within developing countries, there are different capacities. For example, India did keep the vaccines at home, and you're right about that. But did the policies that were put into place with Indian manufacturers favor a sort of distortion and shortage system where, every big pharmaceutical corporation cherry-picked one partner to manufacture their vaccine, which was essentially the Oxford vaccine, the J&J vaccine? There was a larger capacity issue. There were biological companies. There were other vaccine manufacturers who could have been roped in. Why put this difficult decision where you have to choose between your own people and the rest of the world, in the rest of the developing world? And I think this is the exclusive licensing that sort of flows from the kind of intellectual property rights that, for example, you have patents on the Oxford vaccine in India. That's the whole basis of the Serum Institute and AstraZeneca deal, an exclusive license flowing from intellectual property, and of course, the sharing of technology. So I don't completely agree that you can make a sweeping statement about the capacities in different developing, different regions and different developing countries. So I'm going to stop here because I would like to go on, but I thought maybe the other questions.
I think Robin was going to come in to here.
Absolutely.
Did you want to make a point, Robin?
No, I don't really. What I think is this: you must take the view that we cannot have a system where you have very, very difficult, expensive, risky research and say, well, if we reduce the incentive for doing that research, somehow the world would be a better place. This argument is an argument against the patent system itself, and it is run and has been run over the centuries. Its biggest acme was, in fact, in the 19th century, when they abolished patents in some countries. If you don't understand patents, you're against them. If you do understand them, you're for them. Jeremy Bentham wrote words to that effect much more elegantly in 1792, and nothing has changed.
Can I? Yeah, sorry to hear. Yeah, please come in.
Well, I think Robin's right. I mean, the view of the patent system is in the sort of the eye of the beholder. Those who hold the power and those who have it will say it's the best system. Those who don't have it and who have had it forced upon them will actually say differently. I mean, the whole economic development sort of a literature on kicking away the ladder, those that climbed the ladder because they either colonized half of the world or whatever, took their spoils and then implanted patent systems and then tell everyone to say, well, actually, this system's the best for you. I think, you have to look at it from the vantage point of where people are. And then on to just that final point on technology transfer, just remember, Moderna had never produced a product, and all of a sudden, out of 6 months, was able to actually get the required workers, and similarly with BioNTech to actually just create these vaccines. So I think there's a lot of red herrings being thrown around in terms of actually how long this actually takes to actually get going. And Lena's correct that there's different technological capabilities out there. Let's not lump everything into one bucket.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I maybe, sorry, if I could just move on to another question, because I want to sort of try and bring in audience questions more as well. And this is about what feasibly might be possible to change. We obviously know that the WTO is debating this at the moment, and we're seeing some sort of quite dramatic political shifts. The American government, for example, announced in the summer that they were supporting a TRIPS waiver. And I think Japan won't block it either, and it would appear to be, in particularly Germany, Switzerland, and the UK that are holding out against it. But the big debate, I think, will be about how extensive should the reforms be, and this is a sort of a question from Marianne Schneider-Petzinger. So really asking the question: how wide or narrow in scope could or should a TRIPS waiver be related to COVID-19? This issue around how time limited it should be, what it should be targeted on, because perhaps that might be the solution, that some compromise is worked out specifically around sort of COVID-19, which could then be used as a basis for wider reforms in the future. So I don't know what your thoughts. I mean, so Robin, do you think any reforms are needed whatsoever?
I think none are needed, but if there were to be one, it should be confined to vaccines. And I believe we would learn something from it, because I believe the result would be, if it was waived, that no vaccine would actually emerge that hasn't emerged already, but it would have a damaging effect on company investments in future vaccine research. And that is what I fear most, because I fear the next pandemic much more than this one.
Thank you very much. Tahir and Lena, what do you think about the scope? How bold should the reforms be at the moment? And perhaps thinking about what's going to be practical. I mean, the WTO decides things by consensus. So what do you think might be realistic? Either of you two want to take that?
Yeah, so I'm just going to step in, and I know that everyone talks about vaccines a lot, but I'm a treatment activist, and we are treatment providers as Medicines Sans Frontières, and we've seen the kind of intellectual property barriers on antiretrovirals and direct acting antivirals, and we would assume that the scope has to be covering therapeutics. And it has to be a reasonable period of time that allows generic manufacturers to have the freedom to operate, to produce these drugs at scale. When we started to work with generics for HIV in 1999, that was precisely the time when the patent system was rolling in. 2004 was when we saw the scale up. So we had to give them the freedom to operate, to be able to mass produce these drugs generically. And I think absolutely, the patent system speaks for itself when you look at direct acting antivirals. Hepatitis C, the cure for hepatitis C was valued at what, $1,000 a pill. Do we want that to start being repeated for the pandemic as well? We've seen that, prices for monoclonal antibodies are absolutely obscene in the developing world if left to Roche. So we do want alternative producers coming forward. We have an alternative producer for tocilizumab. And what I'm saying is this: it cannot be limited to vaccines. It has to be a reasonable period of time. Ideally, it should cover diagnostics, but I don't want to get into that. And actually, I think anybody who's worked on pharmaceuticals and medicines would know that it's a no-brainer to have a waiver, because developed countries and high-income countries have backed pharmaceutical corporations to undermine compulsory licensing. We wouldn't be having this debate if they hadn't undermined all the public health safeguards in the TRIPS agreement systematically. So, we've got to have the waiver in place so that, we don't have to fight these enforcement battles in Indian courts and other courts. Yeah.
And Tahir, your thoughts on what you think might be feasible through this process?
Well, I think what I'd like to see and what I think might happen are probably two different things. But what I'd like to see is that there's a waiver that is across all the technologies. I feel the concern. I understand Robin's concern and the fear that, oh, if we do something like this, then we're going to entirely tank the system and we'll never recover from it. I actually don't believe that. I think actually the system in the modern age, in the world that we live in today, given the future pandemics, which Robin has highlighted himself, that are likely to occur, given climate change, all these issues are playing out as we speak. And I don't think the current intellectual property system works. Now, should we have a waiver every time? No, not necessarily, but I think we need to reform how the IP systems work for many countries that are going to have to get onto their own feet. And I think that was actually suppressed when the World Trade Organization system came around. So in a way, this is actually a way of compensating for the last 25, 30 years to try and allow them the opportunity to actually build these hubs, build these manufacturers, so that when those next pandemics hit, all this supply and scaling up that we're talking about can actually take place where we don't have to talk about waivers. I think this is the actual first step in that direction, because the system that was imposed only worked for a few, and it was deliberate. Mm-hmm. It was deliberately done that way. So let's not forget that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious that we're just about to hit our hard stop now. Unfortunately, we're going to get cut off. But I think one thing we can all agree on, is that obviously these debates are very much driven by technical considerations, but massively by political considerations as well. I think Tahir very much made the point about power and where the power lies at the moment, and people being reluctant to sort of give up that power. And it's going to be fascinating to see these debates in the WTO and I suppose looking at sort of a number of UN agencies now who are sort of headed up by powerful African leaders. One thinks of WHO, WTO, and UNAIDS as well. Very active sort of people sort of campaigning for greater access, particularly for the continent of Africa. And we're going to be seeing this played out, I'm sure, through the World Health Assembly debates, looking at a pandemic treaty and in future UN gatherings, coming up on this topic. So undoubtedly, this is one to watch. And we in Chatham House, as I say, interested in the politics. We're delighted to host other events like this because there are going to be some very lively debates. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and thank you so much to our panelists for being so open and forthright in their opinions, and let's look forward to these evidence-based debates taking place in the coming months and years. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Goodbye all.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.